Okay, can you guys hear me? Excellent. So good afternoon. I'm Ryan Demopoulos. I'm a program manager who works on Windows 8. I work on the developer experience team. And specifically, I work on the UI controls that all you folks will be using to go and build your Metro-style apps in Windows 8. I've been at Microsoft for about 4.5 years now. I came here straight out of the University of Western Ontario. Are there any other Ontarians or Canadians in the crowd? Very cool, very cool. Good to see you guys. So I came straight at a university. I started working on the Windows Ribbon framework in Windows 7 when I joined the company. You might say that the ribbon, I guess, is kind of the first UI control that I worked on. It's certainly a big one, lots of different subcontrols inside. But also in Windows 8, I've been doing some other things. I've been involved in our efforts to bring spell checking into Trident. So hopefully that's a welcome addition to some of the folks in the audience. Also, I've been working on our text controls, trying to make them a little bit more touch-friendly for the release. But I'm here today to talk to all of you about what I think is one of the crown jewel controls in the entire control suite that we have to offer, and that's the list view control. So today, we're going to talk about how to build a polished collection and list apps in HTML5. I have an absolutely packed agenda, so I'm going to roll right in. I got to get my clicker. There it is. So I'm going to divide the talk up into two general areas. The first one's a little shorter. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what collections are. What do I mean by a collection? What is a collection? And what is the Windows 8 perspective on collections? How do collections work? How do they look and feel in the operating system? Then I'm going to transition over to talk to the list view control. I'm going to introduce it, tell you guys all about it, some of the cool features that it brings to the table. And we're going to do some code dives, take a look at how we can go and make use of this control in the Metro-style apps that we build in HTML. And I hope after this talk I really leave you guys with an understanding of what the list view is, and a pretty good understanding of how it works, how to go and create your first list view and do some cool stuff with it. So I do also want to mention that I definitely will be tight for 60 minutes. So I won't have time for a question and answer at the end, but I will kind of mingle around on the floor and up here on the stage if you guys want to come up and ask me any questions. And I'll be at the expo hall tomorrow. I think it's at 11 until 1 or 1:30. So I'd love to talk to you guys about list view. Definitely come and engage me after the talk at some point. OK, so what's a collection? What do I mean by a collection? I have a super vague definition up here. I call it a set of related user content. And the key emphasis here is user content. It's the stuff that the user wants to get to inside your applications. I have an example up here of Flickr. The primary user content, the collection here, is really the photos that they've added to their photo stream. It's really why they went to Flickr in the first place. It's why they wanted to go and have that experience, go work with their content, all bunched up in that collection. There's actually a couple collections up here. There's photos in the photo stream, and then we actually have another collection kind of on the side, which is sets of photos in the user's account. And the thing about collections are, they are absolutely everywhere. Collections are all over the place. They're part of almost every computing experience that people have today, be it in applications or in websites. And just to give some examples, we've got collections of files in File Explorer, which, by the way, File Explorer ribbon, yay. Really awesome. We've got collections of news articles. When you wake up in the morning, you want to go see the news. And this is user content, don't get me wrong. It's not that the user has to own it, but it's the stuff that they want to go and interact with and play with as a part of their experience. We've got collections of tweets. We've got collections of Twitter feeds. There are collections of emails when you fire up your email client. There's even collections in areas where you might not even think of it as like a collection. Like we've got alarms in the Alarms app. That's really their user content. That's the reason why they started up that application. And then possibly the most encountered type of collection in the world on a daily basis, collections of apps. So collections are absolutely everywhere. And they're not just everywhere. They're almost always the major point of focus in the application that's been created. They're a prominent part of the user interface. They're right up front and center stage. kind of like how I feel right now. and they're right in your face. And they're usually exposed as a list of items that can be browsed through, but there's often a lot of actions and interactivity in those collections. Like you can go and, in addition to browsing the items, you can often select the items. You can add items to the collection, remove items to the collection. So there's lots of different interactive things that you can go and do with these collections. And because they're up front and center, and because they're everywhere, in Windows 8 we really wanted to reimagine how collections look and feel. And you guys have seen pieces of this all over the place. Jensen covered it a little bit. He talked about a lot of different points about how collections of data work. A number of different sessions have covered this stuff. But what I want to do is dive in just kind of to the next level. I'm going to do a very quick demo. I'm going to run the News app and the Build Conference app. And these two apps obviously are pre-installed in your system. You probably have lots of familiar with both of them. They've been demoed plenty, and you've been playing around with the Build Conference app, I'm sure. I want to show you some subtle points about how collections work across the system in Windows 8. So I'm going to go to my super slow KVM, and we're good. I'm going to fire up the News app first. And I'm on the Add Feeds page. This is another collection. It's a collection of feeds that you can go and monitor in this application. And the collection in here really exemplifies, in a lot of ways, the way that we want collections to look and feel in Windows 8. I'll point out a few things. I'll start talking about a little bit of interactivity. And there's points here about touch, keyboard, and mouse, but I'll start with touch first. So obviously, I can pan the list. When I tap down on items, I can go and select those items. But right away, the moment that I touch these items, if you can just take a quick look, you can see that the items have this pressed effect where it looks like I'm pushing down on the item. And the purpose of this effect is for a couple of reasons. One is just to tell the touch user that, hey, you actually hit that thing. Because with touch, there's a totally different set of kind of tactile feedback that the user gets. But the other thing that this does is it really just makes the collection kind of feel alive. It makes it feel like I really am pressing down on those items. You can see that, and you probably have seen across the experiences in Windows 8, that when we have selected items, there's a certain look to how those selected items are visually presented. Like there's a check mark in the upper right-hand corner. It's the same check mark everywhere. It's drawn the same way, the same distance from the edge. And that's just applied consistently across all the collections. And it just sends a statement to users like, hey, that thing is selected. They just kind of know that that's what it looks like. And there's also lots of other interactivity points. Like in this list, I can go and tap items. But sometimes I want to be able to tap an item and navigate into that item and learn a little bit more about it. But I still might want to be able to do multi-select in that list. And so you guys have seen this, I think, on Tuesday. I can do a different action as a touch user, and I can swipe to do multi-select while still being able to tap on items to go into them. And that swipe to select model is applied consistently across all the collections. Now, it is obvious that I can pan this list around, and I'm doing so now. But one thing that might not immediately become apparent is that whenever we have grids of items or grids of stuff, multiple rows, multiple columns, those lists always pan from side to side. It's just kind of like a rule that we've created across the system so that users come to collections and they immediately know how to go and interact with them. It's all about consistency and about expectations for how the user can go and play around with those things. And there's other expectations we have around. Like I can pan this list really fast. I can go like at a pretty good clip there, and it kind of sticks to my finger. It keeps up with me. I have lots of performance expectations. I can let go of the panning, and I get a little bit of inertia. And then when I hit the edge of the list, I get a bounce feedback. Performance and the kind of like panning interactions, those aren't unique to collections, but they are expectations whenever we're presenting collections of information. And it's not just about touch. We have some consistent points of interactivity around keyboard and mouse. And I said that we wanted to reimagine collections in Windows 8, and that's true, but we also didn't want to needlessly reinvent the wheel. There's already a lot of expectations that users have around keyboard and mouse, so we wanted to try and preserve those. So I can use arrow keys just like you'd expect if I'm going through these collections. If I grab the mouse here, I can hover over items. I get a hover effect that just shows what I'm about to go and press on. If I click it down with the mouse, I get that pressed feedback. And I can use the control key modifier to also do multi-select. All the things that you'd kind of expect when you're interacting with these collections are true in Windows 8 as well and done across the board. I just want to show you a couple other really quick things. I'm going to go into the Build Conference app now. And I'm going to very quickly switch between all sessions and my sessions. And I want you to pay attention as to how the items enter the collection. So I'm just going to do it a few different times. And as I go back and forth, you can see that the items kind of slide in from the right. And it's really subtle. I hope it's coming through clear there. I think it is. This is called the entrance animation. And we apply entrance animation on all the collections across the system. It's very subtle, but it goes a long way to making a statement. It says, this list is ready for you. Your items have arrived. You can go and play around with all these different items. They're there for you, and start touching them, start using them. And it's not just the entrance animation. We have other animations. Jensen showed add animations. We've got remove animations. All of these different points really make collections pop out to the user in Windows 8. The last thing I'll show you is list layouts. So I mentioned that whenever we've got a grid, it always pans from side to side. But there's actually a second way that we present collections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap the Build Conference app here. You can see everything's being shown in a single column, top to bottom. And whenever I get a single column of items in a collection, it always pans from top to bottom. So we really present collections in these two different ways across the system. Grids that go from side to side, lists that go from top to bottom, and users instantly know how to go and interact with those collections. So I'm sure this week, how many of you have been thinking about building some kind of a Windows 8 app? I know I've been thinking about it, actually. I get kind of jazzed when I come to these things, and I get to see like what everyone across the company is working on. How is it that you're going to go and get your collections with this kind of level of polish? I mean, how is it that you're going to draw the selection checkmark in the exact right spot? Or how are you even going to have selection at all? Because you have to build all of that in if you were going to go and create an HTML application. Or all those entrance animations, add animations, all those things. I think you guys know where I'm going. The obvious answer here is the list view control. The list view control is your vehicle to make a polished Metro-style collection in a Win app in HTML. Now, the list view control is part of the Windows library for JavaScript. We call it WinJS for short. Hopefully you guys have heard a little bit about this by this time now. But this is a suite of controls built in JavaScript for you to go and use to create Metro-style apps in HTML. And that means that the list view itself is built in JavaScript, which I think is really neat. I know how many lines of code. No, I won't tell you. But it's really neat to see how much power you can get out of the JavaScript platform in Windows 8. It's just really amazing as to the things that you can do. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. And both of the apps that I just showed you use this exact control, the WinJS or JavaScript list view control. And it's used all over the place. We don't just use it here. We use it in Socialite, Alarms, Tweetorama, Stocks. This is 4 of like many, many applications that we use it in. We even use it in the Windows Store. So if you've seen anything about the Windows Store, if you've seen the list of applications that you can pan through, that is the WinJS list view control that is being used there when you go and interact with the store on a regular basis. It's all built in JavaScript. So we've really got, I think, a great story there. We really feel that this control is the best way to expose a collection in Windows 8 because it's got that look and feel built in. It'll make your app feel familiar to users. We use it all over the place. And so if you have a collection that you're exposing, you want it to be the list view control so that they get to take advantage of all that familiarity, being able to swipe items, pan side to side when it's a grid, and things like that. And finally, it's got a lot of powerful features that are easy to use, and I want to talk to you about that. That's what I'm going to spend the rest of our time about. And I want to show you how to really work with the list view through a series of demos. Just before I jump into that, this is the biggest takeaway of the talk. The list view is the way to make polished collections in apps for Windows 8. It's what we use. We use it all over the place. If you're making an HTML application, you should consider using this right up front to expose your collections. So how do we get started with the list view? You guys have seen little bits and pieces, I think, mixed amongst different talks, but I'm really going to kind of dissect it and give it to you step by step throughout this talk. The list view needs 3 things to show really anything useful. It's not quite as simple as a button, but these three things are pretty straightforward. The first of these things is a data source. This is your data. This is what you're going to go load into the list view control itself. It's what you want to go and show. And the list view is really flexible. It can take data from all kinds of different locations. You can hard code the data in if you want to. You can also pull it from disk. You can even pull data from a web service. You can go and write your own custom data source and just really pull data from anywhere. It's totally flexible in that regard. The next thing that you need is an item renderer. And the item renderer is a description for how all of the data in that data source should be rendered in the view. And that description is broken up into two pieces. There's a description of the structure. So like, for example, I might want an image, and then I might want some primary text and some secondary text or something like that. And then there's the styling around all of that visualization. And that styling is done in CSS. So if you have skills in CSS, a lot of that will shine through. The last thing you need is a layout. You might have heard a little bit about list view and grid view. And on the HTML side of things, we have a list view control, and it has layouts. And grid view is actually accomplished by a list view with a grid layout. But there's those two different layouts that I talked about. There's the grid layout that pans from side to side, the list layout that pans up and down. The key thing about this step is it's almost a no-op, because we have both of those layouts built into the control. So all you have to do is just go say which one you want. There is the ability to make a custom layout, but I'm not going to talk about that because that's a more super advanced level topic. You, generally speaking, want to use the grid layout or the list layout. So I want to jump into code. I want to show you guys how to create your first ever list view. I'm going to go step by step and really talk through it. And I'm going to do a little bit of role playing here. I'm going to pretend that I'm a photographer, which is hilarious because I'm terrible at photography. And I am going to create a new application from scratch called Photo Sale. And the whole purpose of this application is that I want to go and sell some photos that I took. Very simple. We're going to go and create our first list view. And so I'll just get started. Oh, yeah, I got to switch over here. Great. So I've got Visual Studio open. I am going to start right from the beginning. So I'm going to go File, New Project. I'm going to use a navigation application template. The reason I chose this one, there's really two reasons. It has all of the Windows library for JavaScript files already built in. And it doesn't already have a list view, because list views are everywhere, and a couple of these different templates already have list views. I really want to show you how to make one from scratch, so I'm going to start from the beginning. I'm going to call it Photo Sale. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking through the structure of these templates. I encourage you guys to go in and kind of like play around, get to learn with how the templates are organized. I do want to, however, call out homepage.html. This is where the bulk of our work is going to be done on the HTML side. And I'm going to actually run this application just to show you where we're starting from. Should just come up in a second. It'll say, welcome to Photo Sale at the top. There it is. And it's inviting me to go and add some content. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go add a list view to sell all of my photos. So let me scroll down. Sorry, I know as I move my head, it gets louder and quieter, but I'll try and normalize on the fly. So I'm going to go and delete that paragraph tag, and I'm going to go insert our very first list view. And this isn't quite complete, but I'm going to show you and walk you through each of these steps. By the way, I'm using code snippets from Toolbox so that you guys don't have to suffer through me debugging up here, because that would just be ugly. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a div. I'm using data-win-control. This may be familiar to you already by now. I'm basically saying I want to turn this div into a list view control. And I'm providing it some options through the data-win options attribute. And these are kind of like constructor parameters for the control, essentially. And the three things that I said that every list view needs is exactly what we have up here: a data source, an item renderer, and a layout. So I want to go and add a data source. Before I can even do that, I need some actual data. So I have some data here. I've got a bunch of photos that represent all of these are just the thumbnails that represent the photos that I want to sell. So I'm going to go and add those into my project. Put them in the images file. There it is. And then After that, I need to actually go and add a description of all of the data that I want to go and show in my application. So to do that, I'm going to add a new JavaScript file just because I like working from clean files. I'm going to call it data.js. We'll do all of our data-related coding in there. And I want to remember that to also include data.js from our HTML. So I'll just go and do that. Done. And I'm going to go and actually insert the data that represents all the different photos I'm trying to sell. So a little bit more code, and we're good. This isn't complicated code, lots of lines, but it's pretty straightforward. I have an array that's full of a bunch of different JSON objects. Each one of these represents a photo I want to sell. And on each of them, there's 3 properties. There's a description, that's like the name of the photo, a link to the thumbnail, and a price. So the list view needs a data source, and a data source is a thing. We provide some data sources out of the box, and the simplest one that we provide is called array data source, and that's exactly what I need to go and take this array and turn it into a data source. So I'm going to go and do that, and it takes me 1 line of code to do that, because array data sources are really easy. So what I've done, I'm creating a new array data source. It's called myPhotoData. And I'm dumping in photo data, which is my array here. And that completes the data source. I can take that data source and go drop it into the list view control, just like that. And that essentially completes the first step. Now, this is as simple as data sources get. There are far more complex topics around data sources and how to pull data from really interesting places. There's a talk immediately after mine, and I'll mention it again later on, that goes into this in a greater level of detail and will show you how to hook up to other interesting types of data sources, even write your own around your own web service. So you'll definitely want to check that out. This is kind of hello world-y. But hopefully it'll illustrate the concepts. So I've got my data in there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove everything else and just show you what you get if you just have the data. Remember, I said there's 3 things you need to show anything useful. If you just have a data source, you're going to get something like this. It's not really interesting because the list view really doesn't know how to render any of that content. It's just kind of doing a toString. So what I'm going to do is add the other 2 important ingredients. The first of those is an item renderer. Now, an item renderer is a mechanism for returning essentially trees of HTML elements to represent each piece of data in your data source. That's all the list view is. It's just a bunch of HTML elements, and all the items inside are just a bunch of HTML elements. And so that mechanism can be a couple things. You can just go write a function in JavaScript. It can be a simple function that just returns back trees of HTML elements for every single piece of data that's fed into it. But there's another way to do it, which I think is easier, which is to use a template control. And a template control is another type of control in the Windows library for JavaScript, and it allows you to describe the data declaratively in HTML and then style it with CSS. And that's what I'm going to use, and I'm not going to build my own template control here. There's no need to do that. We have 19 different ready-to-go templates that you can go and take from Dev Center and modify those templates to however you need to use them. And that's what I'm going to go and use. So this is running live from Dev Center. You guys can go and access this at any time. I'm on the Adding List View Controls article. And if I just scroll down a little bit, you'll see there's a couple pages. Item templates for list layouts and item templates for grid layouts. I'm going to be laying out my photos in a grid, so I'll go into there. And here's the templates that we provided for grid layouts. The thing I'll mention about the templates, they exist because we use them. We added the templates as our different applications, as the interns, and so on and so forth. We're building all of the apps around there. We just felt that these were a really great set of starting points for you to go and get kind of like a Metro-style look and feel. And so I'm going to use the, it's called Image Overlay Album template. Every template has 2 pieces, HTML and CSS. And on this website, there's actually 2 pieces of CSS because your application can either be in a dark theme or a light theme, and you want to copy the CSS that's appropriate. My application's in a dark theme, so I am going to copy all the CSS here. And I'm just going to go into my homepage.css file, head to the bottom, and paste it in. That covers all of the CSS I need for that template. I'll go back to the website and pick up the HTML too, because I need that. And I'll even put in a little marker here so that we can see what's going on. There it is. So that is the HTML I pasted from Dev Center, and I'll walk you through it a little bit. I'm creating a new template control in this div, and the interesting stuff really is in here. This is where all of your items are described, the structure of how those items should be. So I'm saying I've got a grid of stuff, and inside that thing I've got an image tag that's going to show up, and over top of that image I'm going to have an overlay. You'll see it's kind of got like a translucent effect. And then over top of that overlay I've got some strong text and some light text. And a key piece I want to point out about how these templates work, they support data binding. That's really how they know how to grab data from your data source, and it's done through this attribute here, the data-win-bind attribute. So what this is saying is I am trying to data bind to the source attribute of the image element, and I'm trying to bind to something in my data called image URL. Now if we switch over to our data file, we don't have an image URL. Doesn't exist. We do have an image source, however, and that's exactly the type of thing that I want to go and data bind into that image. So I can just go in and kind of replace it. This will give you guys a pretty good idea of what the experience is like. If you're going to go and take these templates, you're going to have to go fix them up a little bit because we don't know anything about your data source when we post them on Dev Center. So just go and adapt them, add pieces to them, modify the CSS, modify the HTML however you need to. They're really great starting points. They get you like 80% of the way there. I don't have a text album or a text artist either, but I do have a price that I want to be as my strong text, and I have a description that I want to make as my light text. So I've got my template control. I've got the CSS for the template control. I'm going to take that template, feed it in as the item renderer, and then that is all I need to do in order to get all of those items in my data source actually being rendered with HTML trees in the list view control. And before I run it, the third step I said was the easiest. It's by far the easiest, setting your layout. We have the two different layouts built in, the list layout, the grid layout. I'm going to go and use the grid layout. And here's how I do that. Oops. Just like that. So I'm adding in an object. A layout is an object. That's how it's represented. And I'm just setting the type to winjs.ui.gridlayout. And that's how I go and get that grid layout. Now, if I run this application, I should have something much more interesting. And I do. I've got all of the different photos that I want to go and sell. All of my information is being properly data bound in. And you'll notice that just by using those templates online and by using the list view control itself, you can see that it already is starting to take on, actually pretty strongly, the look and feel of a collection in Windows 8. I can go and tap on items. I get those selection visuals being drawn exactly how they should be drawn, the check marks right in the right spot. I can go and swipe different items to go and select. I can pan around. I have things like inertia and the bounce effect and so on. And I also have pretty good performance. And I want to talk a little bit about performance because the list view does something interesting when it comes to performance. I have like 50 items in this collection. Actually, I think it's 52. And that's not a whole lot of items. So it's no like magical feat of engineering that I've got really good panning performance because we have a really great touch panning platform that you can go and build. And Reed Townsend and Nick Wagner gave a great talk on that whole topic. So you guys should go check that out on the video if you haven't seen it. But the list view is able to scale to hundreds or even thousands of items. We know collections are big. You can go and load lots of stuff into the list view. So the question is, how does it do it? Because we have, this is all just HTML elements. Each one of these items is, I think, 5 HTML elements. What if I had 2,000 items in this list? That's 10,000 HTML elements. And that's a major tax on the system. It would be a major tax on memory. It would be a major performance issue to try and go and render all those things on the screen. And the way that the list view achieves this is through virtualization. So as I'm panning around, the list view senses that I'm going over to the right, and it's hitting the data source and saying, hey, data source, I need more data. Then it's running that data through your item renderer, and then laying down the bricks as you step on them while you're panning. And it's not only doing that, when you're leaving items behind, it's also destroying those HTML trees to keep the set in memory at a decent amount. And that virtualization, which is pretty complicated stuff, I can honestly say that, it's all built into the control. It's on by default. You don't have to go and use any of that. And so we really try and go the extra mile to make sure that you meet those performance goals of how we want collections to work across the system. Now, I'm almost done with my very first list view, but there's a couple problems. I don't know if it's really all that obvious, but Maxwell here, it looks like he's a little squished. He needs to be a little bit wider, and that's just because the template I copied in assumes that the pictures all need to be square. The other problem with this is that I'm not really happy with the interactions. I can single select items, but I can't multi-select, and I might want somebody to be able to go and build or purchase multiple photos in one shot. So I'm just going to go and fix both of those issues really quickly, and I'll show you how to do that. First, I'm going to fix the image issue. So here's all the CSS I pasted in. And again, it's all about just taking these templates and modifying them how you need them. This is saying make the items 130 by 130. That's not going to work for me. I know that my thumbnails are 173 by 130, so I've just fixed that. Then if I want to solve the multi-select problem, here's how I would do it. There's lots of different properties you can set on the list view, a ton of different things that you can go and tell it to do. To change the selection to allow for multi-select, this is the default value single. That's what the list view will supply if you give it nothing. I just have to type multi. So change the selection mode to multi. That's going to give me a multi-select list view. And not only that, I'll show you another property here while I'm at it. Say I wanted to have it so that I could swipe to multi-select, but if I tap on an item, it actually navigates into that photo. Maybe it shows a high-res version or something. I can just control that by just setting the tap property. The default is select and invoke, but here I just want it to only fire an invoke message. So I'm just going to tell it to invoke. So setting the interaction mode is really simple. There's other properties that you can go and use to go and do that, but that gives you, I think, an idea of how to do it. So if I run this application now, we should be pretty much to the end of creating my first list view. You can see I've got all the images are showing up much better. Maxwell here is doing great. And when I tap on them, it's not selecting, but I can still use that swipe gesture to go and do multi-select and select multiple things. So hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good understanding of what it's like to build your first list view and how the list view is working under the covers to really make a great collection experience in your application. And I want to talk about a couple more gradually advanced topics, so I'm just going to kind of continue to move on. One problem that we have with this application right now is that it's kind of difficult to essentially pick a picture to buy because they're all just kind of smushed together. They're sorted by price, which is great. But if I had a budget, like take a look, like my cheapest picture is $550. My most expensive one is $579,000. By the way, when I said I wasn't a good photographer, I'm actually a great photographer. But like, how is somebody going to go and pick the picture they want? You know, people have budgets, right? Some people might only be willing to spend $2,000 on my pictures. Some people might be willing to spend huge sums of money on my pictures, and they're not even interested in the smaller ones. And the way that we want to make this a little bit more accessible for people is to group them up into different price categories. And that's the next topic that I want to talk to you guys about. That's grouping. So I'm just going to switch back here. Now, when it comes to grouping, you've seen grouping, by the way, already. You've seen it in both the Build Conference app and also the News app. And the list view tries to make the whole process around grouping easy to do in a visually aesthetic way, in a way that's really true to Metro. Like, for example, it tries to insert just the right amount of space between the groups so that there's a clear delineation of where a group begins and ends. It tries to also add the right amount of space between the groups themselves and the headers, that's the labels up top. It does some other things too, like if you want to go and just show a very simple Metro-style kind of text-based header up at the top. You don't have to go and set the font family or the point size or anything like that. It'll take care of all that for you. It really tries to make the process of grouping pretty straightforward to kind of get it right. there is two things that you will need to do in order to group up your stuff, and they're fairly familiar tasks. The first one is to provide a group data source. This is an additional data source to the data source that you provided for your regular items, and the whole point of this data source is to describe how the items in the primary data source should be grouped together. Then after you've provided that, you need to provide a group renderer. And this is just like an item renderer, except its purpose is to go and render all of the headers that you see up top. And you can do really fancy headers or make them interactive if you want to. Or you can just have them simple, like what we often present in the applications that we've pre-installed on your systems. And so I want to jump right back into code. I'm going to pick up where we left off, and I'm going to show you guys how to do some grouping in the list view. And we'll go through those two steps that I just described. So let me just switch back here. And we're picking up right where we left off. I said that there's two things we need. The first thing is a group data source. So I'm going to go add one. And I need to go and actually create a group data source that I can feed into this list view. So I'm going to jump over to my JavaScript file. And I will insert some code that gets us started on that path. There it is. So what this is doing is it's creating a group data source called price groups. And there's two things I need to feed into this constructor. The first thing is the data source that I'm trying to group up. And so that is the my photo data source that I showed you earlier. Those are all the different items that we want to put into groups. The second thing you have to feed into the group data source is what we call a group by function. And the group by function is just a mechanism to describe for every one of those items what group should I go and put that item into. So I am going to add a group by function. It's not super complex. I'll walk you through it. My function is called group by price because I'm grouping into price categories. And it is a function that takes in items one at a time for every item that's in that data source. And it is expected to return information on what group that thing should be in. And it does that through this object that I'm returning here. So an object with two properties. The first property is a key. And this is a unique string identifier that identifies the group that you want to go and put that item into. And I emphasize string intentionally because if you try and throw numbers in there, it's going to kind of barf on you. But if you put a string in, that's what it needs. And that string identifier can be anything. If you just want to go and have a new group, you don't have to upfront declare or anything like that. Just make sure that you return the same string for any items that you want to put into the same group. And then the second piece is a data payload. And the data just describes essentially metadata on the group that you're returning information on. And this is sometimes fancy if you want to go and make a really fancy header, for example. But here I'm just returning a header title. That's it. And that header title is one of these 5 strings that represent the 5 groups that are being created. So I take that group by function. I'll feed it into the data source constructor. And that completes the data source. Now all I have to do is take that group data source and put it into the list view. And that's the first step. That gets all of my items grouped. The second thing I said I needed was a group renderer. Now, a group renderer is just like an item renderer, but for headers. And I can specify it using a template control just like I did before. I'm not going to grab a pre-made template. This is going to be so simple that I just wrote one from hand, and I'll just go and paste it in here. There it is. So this is the template for my header. It's got one element in it. And it's doing data binding of the inner text of that div to the header title that was being returned by the group by function that I showed you right there. And so that gets groups up and running. And if not almost. I have to actually put the header in there. There it is. That would get groups up and running. And just before I run it, I want to show you one other little trick in here. All of the different groups that I've shown you and that you've seen, at least in the News app and in the Build app, all of those group headers are rendered to the top of the list. But there's actually 2 positions that you can go and put your group headers. You can put them at the top, or we sometimes think it's cool to put them to the side. And this is how you do that. As I had mentioned, top is the default. but I'm going to go and put my group headers to the left. Now if I go and run this, we should have our photo sale application all grouped up. And there it is. So we've got our items all put into 5 different groups. The headers are being rendered to the side. I never had to set any font family or anything like that on it, and it just kind of makes the list a lot cleaner to look at. But the 2 things to remember, the 2 steps: first, add a group data source, an additional data source to your original one, and then add a group renderer, which is just like an item renderer. So a lot of those kind of skills that you learn in the first demo transfer over. It's really the group by function that's doing most of the work there. Great. So I want to switch topics to another thing, which is kind of related to groups in some ways, and that is semantic zoom. You guys have heard a lot about semantic zoom. It was shown throughout a number of different demos on Tuesday. It's been a part of a lot of different talks. I think it's gathered a lot of attention, and I think there's a reason it's gathered a lot of attention. It's pretty cool. So semantic zoom is a way to help your users explore your collection. And it's especially useful in larger collections. Now, I remember when we were kind of mid-cycle through Windows 8, and we were building a list view control. We had touch panning hooked up. But we didn't yet have inertia hooked up. So you would run your finger across the screen, and the list would just go flying. Dozens and dozens and dozens of items just kind of flying by. And this was actually made even more interesting because you also couldn't stop the list. So when you put your finger down, it would just keep going. It was total chaos. But eventually, we got inertia hooked up, and it confirmed our suspicions that it was going to be really tough for touch users to go and navigate around inside a collection that was really large, because you just have to keep wiping the screen over and over and over as you pan and pan and pan and pan and pan. And so semantic zoom is the answer to that. It was really born out of the desire to solve the large collection panning problem for touch. But I would argue that it is useful for touch, keyboard, and mouse, and I want to show you guys why I think that is. So I'm going to go back into the Build Conference app. I'm going to fire it up here. I better switch over to. And really give you guys a sense of what semantic zoom does and why I think it's pretty handy. Great. So I'm back exactly where I was on the All Sessions page. And if I was to go and pan through this list, I think I counted it once. There's like lots of sessions. You guys know that. You're probably having like a tough time trying to pick what session you want to go to half the time. Thanks for picking mine, by the way. And it probably takes like 20 or 30 different pans to get through this whole list, and it's just tedious. Semantic zooms, when you put your fingers down, you pinch together, and it gives you a semantic view of all of the different items in the large collection that you have, what I call the zoomed-in view. And I can go and tap to go back into a specific group, but it doesn't just work for touch. I can do it for keyboard, too. Like I can press Control- and it zooms out. I can zoom right back in with Control+. I can hold down the Control key and run the mouse wheel. That'll zoom out, and I can maybe go and pick the hardware track and zoom into that. The reason why I think that it's useful for keyboard and mouse is that semantic zoom allows users to do something they've never been able to do before, and that is to go immediately and instantly to a specific spot in the list. Now, before semantic zoom, you had scroll bars. Well, you still have scroll bars. But when you take a scroll bar and you go down 75% of the way, it is precise, but it's not intentional. You just kind of like get there, and you hope you arrived at where you want to be. And then you usually have to kind of fiddle around with it a little bit, or maybe you play with the arrows, or maybe you run the scroll wheel a bit to just get it just right. Semantic zoom is like an instant transportation mechanism to go right to where you want. That's why I think it really does benefit all 3 different types of input paradigms, the touch, keyboard, and mouse. And if I was going to describe semantic zoom to somebody, I would call it 2 things: fun and function. We talked a little bit about the function. You can kind of go and zoom into a direct spot. I think that's very powerful. It gives users a lot of control over their collection. Another really functional aspect of it, it helps users see the full context of their collections immediately. As soon as I zoomed out over all those sessions, you knew exactly what tracks were there. You didn't have to go through the entire list and pan around. And so that's really what it brings to the table. But it's also a lot of fun. It's really neat to have that kind of authority and power over your collection to be able to go to specific spots instantly. And I would say that semantic zoom is a great way to raise the polish level of your collection. It's never something that's really absolutely essential. Users can get around without having semantic zoom, but it raises the bar and the dimension level on your application, and it will really make your app stand out if you have this kind of experience built over top of your collections. And it's not just for large collections. It's kind of neat in collections of really all different sizes. So what does it take to hook it up? Semantic zoom, I think, is pretty straightforward. The first thing I'll say is that it's not a feature of the list view. It's its own control. And it's a general purpose control. You don't have to semantic zoom and have a list view involved at all. But we've tried to make it especially good semantic zooming between two different list views because that's really the primary scenario that we think most people is going to be doing. And so I am going to, oh, sorry, I didn't talk through my points. The first thing you need is a group by function. And you'll remember in PhotoSale that we already have a group by function. And that's actually pretty standard. By the time you're trying to do semantic zoom, you've typically grouped up all of your different items. So this is usually a non-step in the sense that you've already done it. After that, there's three main steps. You need to add a zoomed out list view. Then you need to place both of those list views inside the semantic zoom control. And the key step is to add a grouped item data source. This is the glue that connects those two list views together so that you can go and zoom in between them. Now I'm going to go in and show you guys how to do that. So I'm going to switch back to the application. And just like before, we'll pick up where we left off. So the first thing I said we needed was a group by function, and you'll recall that we have one. The group by price function, I don't have to change it or do anything, so that step's done. The next thing we need to do is add a zoomed out list view. So I'm going to actually comment out the zoomed in one just for a moment so that we can focus on making the zoomed out one. And I'm going to get it started. Here's the code that I need for that. So it's like any list view. You need a data source, an item renderer, and a layout. I'm also going to set the selection mode, and I'm going to set this to none. If somebody goes and interacts with an item in the zoomed out view, I don't want that to be selectable at all. I don't want it to give it a check mark. I don't want people swiping that thing. I just want them to be able to go right back into their group, so that's why I'm turning that off. Layout is an interesting discussion. I could make it a list or I could make it a grid. I generally think it's best to have the same layout between the two different views. So if you have a grid layout that's laying things out horizontally and is panning horizontally, and you zoom out, it seems to make kind of cognitive sense that your zoomed out higher level meta view also is laid out as a grid. So I'm going to use the same layout as before. And actually, as I'm typing this, I'm realizing I don't even need this because the list view's default layout is grid, so I'll just get rid of it. I don't even have to put that in there. Then we need a data source. The zoomed out view, what we want to see as the items are the groups that we had in the zoomed in view. That's what we want to go and take a look at. Turns out we already have a group data source. It's called price groups. We added it in the last demo. So I can just take that price groups data source, put it in as my primary data source on the zoomed out view, and I'm done. So that completes feeding in the data source. And then we need an item renderer, a way to render those different groups when we're in that zoomed out view. I've shown you a couple different item renderers already that are template controls above. And I mentioned earlier on in the talk that an item renderer is just a mechanism for spitting back HTML trees. And you can do this in a function. There's reasons why you might want to do it in a function. You might want to have conditional logic in there, for example. And so I'm going to go and add a function and show you how that's done. So in my data file, I'm going to go down a little bit and add an item rendering function. It's called zoom renderer. And I'll walk you through what it's doing. Remember that the items in the zoomed out view are the groups. So it's going to feed in 5 different items for those 5 different groups. For each one of them, I am creating a div, which is going to be the root of that tree of HTML elements that I want to return. I'm doing a bit of styling on it. I could have done the styling in CSS, but as you guys may have noticed, I'm doing lots of evil things like inline styles and all kinds of stuff. So it's just easier for me to show it all to you here. But I'm saying I want 10 pixels between all the items. I want to make the background blue. And I want them to be pretty big, 230 pixels by 230 pixels. And then underneath that div, I am going to be creating a paragraph tag. I'm going to append it to the tree so that it's part of that tree that I'm returning. And this is probably the most important line here. That p tag, the inner text of it, is going to be assigned to the header title of the group that is being returned by the group by function. If you remember, that's where the header title is coming from. So I'm kind of like doing my own data binding here, basically. And I do a little bit more styling, which isn't interesting, and that completes the function. So it's going to be returning a div with a p tag underneath that's got my header in it. I'll take that zoom renderer, feed it into the list view, and that completes the zoomed out view. So if I run this, because I commented out the zoomed in view, you can see that's what I'm going to get when I pinch out. I'm going to see my 5 different price groups. If I tap on them, they don't do anything interesting. That's because we're only through step 1 of semantic zoom. The second step is to go and add both of those list views inside a semantic zoom control. So I'll go and do that. I'm going to uncomment the first list view that I built, and then I'm going to go and add a semantic zoom control. There it is. And this is a div. I want to turn it into a semantic zoom control using data-win-control. There's more of that juicy inline styling where I've got the height of 70%, which is the same as the height of the list views inside it that I want to go and zoom in between. And there's no options to set even. We really have tried to make it pretty easy to do this between 2 different list views. All I need to do is take these list views and put them inside the control. So I'm going to cut them, paste them in, fix the wacky styling, and there it is. I have a semantic zoom control, inside it 2 list views, my zoomed in list view, which is what users will see when they initially start up the application, and the zoomed out view after it. So that's the second step. The last thing I need to do is add what's called a grouped item data source. The grouped item data source is the connector between these 2 different list views. It's what the semantic zoom uses to know that when I tap on this item in the zoomed out one, I go to this specific group, and so on. So I'll go and add that grouped item data source. And to get it started, it's 1 line again. The grouped item data source takes 2 things. You need the data source of the zoomed in list view. So if I go to the zoomed in list view, you can see that my data source is called my photo data. We created that a while ago. I'm going to take that data source and put it in as the first property, or the first parameter. Then I need a group by function. Remember I mentioned that if you want to do semantic zoom, you have to have a group by function. And we already have that. I don't need to modify it. I can take that group by function. And with this information, it's going to create this grouped item data source, which will allow me to kind of glue this whole experience together. I take my zoomable photos grouped item data source, and I'm going to replace the data source in my zoomed in list view. So it's kind of like a special data source that will still show all of those items, still in a grouped way, but it'll allow semantic zoom to go and glean some extra information that it needs. And now, if I run this application, we should have a semantic zoom experience. So you can see that I can pan around just like before. Nothing looks different, except I can go and pinch on items, and I am taken to my zoomed out view. And I can go and stretch my way back in if I want to by taking my fingers on the screen and then pushing them out, or I can zoom out and tap on items and so on and so forth. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of what's involved with semantic zoom. The group by function you almost always have, so you really need to add that zoomed out view, add the semantic zoom control, put the list views inside, and then connect them together with a grouped item data source. That's pretty typical experience of how you're going to go and wire all that stuff up. So I'm going to transition over to just the last kind of small set of topics here that I'm going to call finishing touches. This is really just a few different things that I want to talk about to raise the polish level of your lists, and also just how to handle some experiences you might run into. And actually, the first thing you might run into is snap view. So you guys, I think, are aware of what snap view is now. It's when your application kind of goes from that full view to being docked on the side of the screen. Applications are going to be snapped at any time. And because the list view shows collections, and because collections are so upfront and center, we get this question all the time when people are using our APIs. What do I do with my list view if somebody just snaps my app? What on earth am I going to do? It's not too complicated. The first thing you should do is determine whether you need to do anything at all. If you have 2 or 3 different list views on the screen, you might not have enough room in Snap View to show everything. So sometimes you might need to hide that list view or find some alternate representation for how you want to go and show that data. But typically speaking, your list view is kind of up front and center. It's probably in a grid layout most of the time. You really do need to do something. And so here's what you do. There's 2 steps and maybe a third. The first is you want to change your layout from grid layout to list layout. And we saw this in the build conference app, actually. You change it to that single column, panning up and down type of situation. You don't have to destroy the list view to do this. You can change the layout on the fly. Just go into the layout property, change it to the built-in list layout that you've got, and you're good. The second thing you need to do is adjust your CSS to shrink the width of the list view to no more than 302 pixels. And that's not a typo. Snap View is 320 pixels wide, but we have found that 302 pixels just happens to be the right number to allow the list view a little bit of breathing room when it draws its scroll bar on the side between that and the edge of the Snap View. So this is, I think, just the right number. You can make it whatever you want. You can make it a full 320 if you want. But this is Ryan Demopoulos' recommendation, 302 pixels. And then the last thing you may need to do is change your item renderer. And I would say most of the time you need to do this. Because when you were showing that grid of items, they might have been big and had lots of content, and they were like right in your face. And then all of a sudden you snap over, and you've got limited real estate there. And you may have to go and change how those items are represented. The other point that I want to make is that in a large grouped collection, you may want to consider doing something, kind of an extra step. If you snap a very large grid-like collection that's grouped, you're going to get a single column, and that list is going to become ginormous because everything is just being kind of stacked on top of each other. And it might be so big that you may just want to show just the groups in this case. So create a data source that's just got those groups. And then when a user taps on one of those items, you can swap the data source on the fly to just the items within that group. And you can do that all on the fly. You don't have to go and destroy the list view. Like I say, you just change your data source to go and change the items in it. So that's just kind of like a little tip if you've got a really large collection with lots of stuff. Here's the code that I had to write for handling Snap View. I got just a couple more things I want to talk about, so I'm just going to kind of skip right to the if statement. But the top part of the if statement here is what I'm running when I snap. I'm changing it to list layout on the fly, and I'm calling a method on the list view called refresh. Refresh forces the list view to recalculate its layout. So change your layout, call refresh, and you're good. And then on the else side, I'm going from snap to unsnapped, and I would change back to grid layout and call refresh again. So that's kind of how you handle the Snap View. There's a little bit of CSS I added to. The bold stuff was the only part that I added to the template, and I'm just changing the width to 302 pixels. The next thing I want to tell you about is styling the list view itself. We talked a lot about how the items are just trees of elements. You style them with CSS. But what if you want to change something on the list view? Like what if you want to change a selection color, for example? You have a fascination with pink, as you'll see that I have in a minute. The answer to this, you'll recall that the list view is built out of JavaScript, out of DOM or HTML elements. And so it's just a big tree itself. And what we do, we attach CSS classes to all of the different pieces of the list view so that all you have to do is write a selector that targets the piece that you want to style and then just style it. It's just simple like that. So if I wanted to go and make the selection color pink, here's what I'd do. I'd have to add a couple little bits of CSS here. The first one targets the selection background. That's just a class that's been added by the list view. And you can see that we're doing the CSS triangle border trick, which is kind of fun for any CSS heads in the crowd. And And then we're also styling the selection hint, which is the checkmark that shows behind when you go and swipe that item. That gives you an idea of like how you style the different pieces of the list view. Just find the piece that you want, write the CSS that selects that piece, and then go and apply your styling. And then the last thing I want to mention to you, just as I'm kind of wrapping up, keep in mind that because everything is HTML, there is a lot of potential for you guys to show really interesting things in the list view. You have the full power of HTML at your disposal to go and show stuff. And so that really makes the content limitless. You can show all kinds of things that you can express in HTML. You can show other Windows library for JavaScript controls inside the list view items. And actually, one of the interesting controls to do is the rating control. You can imagine a rating control inside all those different items, and that's provided in the Win.js library. You can even add interactive elements inside, and I wanted to show an example of that. So in Photo Sale, in that initial template that I created, I just added a button here. You'll see that I'm doing something important. I'm setting a class win-interactive on that button. Anytime you have an interactive item inside one of these list view items, you want to set that class, and it sends a message to the list view. Don't eat these events. Don't do fancy things when I tap on items. Don't start like checking them and stuff like that. I want to go and just interact just specifically with that item. I want it to win when it comes to touches or when you're mouse clicking and things like that. So remember to set that on any interactive elements inside the list view items. So we covered a bunch of different topics. Here's the big takeaways for you guys today, and the top one is the biggest. List view is the way to do collections in Windows 8. It's what we use all over the place. I showed you a couple applications. Many of the applications that you have pre-installed on your system use this control. It really is one of the premier controls as a part of the Windows library for JavaScript that does a lot of stuff to get a really great Metro look and feel in your app. It's got some great features that'll make your app stand out. I certainly couldn't tackle them all, and I really wanted to go deep into the ones that I have gone into. But there are other things to talk about. You should go and check out our documentation that will kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the other interesting things you can do with it. And remember that the list view is built in JavaScript. So you can use your skills in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript itself to go and code against the control and do kind of cool things with all of those different languages. I do want to mention that there's a key upcoming session. It's happening at 4 o'clock, which is in like a half hour, or just maybe slightly under a half hour. It's Sam Spencer's talk on building data-driven collection and list apps using the list view in HTML. The title is very similar to mine. But the key piece here is the data-driven part. Sam is going to be jumping into data sources and item renderers in a deeper way than I did today. He's going to talk about some other interesting things you can do with the template controls and how to go and build data sources that are more interesting than just an array that's shoved into your application. I also want to mention there's some good sessions that you guys might want to catch after the fact. They've already happened. One key one is session 211, creating Metro-style apps quickly with built-in controls. This session was given by Paul Gusmarino, and it gives kind of like a lay of the land of all the different controls at your disposal in that Windows library for JavaScript, and also standard controls as a part of the HTML standard. Also, we have some SDK samples for the list view, so go check those out. I think there's 6 of them. And they're really great to get inspiration, to go take a look at code and kind of see how we go and code stuff up. We've got documentation. That's where you get those ready-to-use item renderer templates like the one I used today. And other than that, I really want to thank you guys for paying attention and just kind of listening to me go on about the list view. I love the list view control. I do want to say one thing. Please fill out the session feedback. It means a lot to us as speakers. We do a lot of prep. We get up here. We got no idea whether or not it was a good talk or a bad talk. And we really want to make all of our conferences that we do as impactful as possible for you guys. So please go and fill that out. And otherwise, I hope you guys have a lot of fun building polished collections with list apps. And thanks again for your time.